My name is MaryPearl, and I'm still an ALANON who's happy, joyous, and free. Is there anybody in here who was not on the committee? I think that's neat. I was telling Tegan, I said, if I only had one day in my life left to live, I'd come here because it would seem like forever. I love to play with people. I just love to play with people. I want to sincerely thank the committee and everybody who has done anything, and the people who came to participate. You know, everybody that's here, I'd like to thank you for having allowed me the privilege to come to your wonderful part of the country here and to share my experience, strength, and hope. It's always neat to be invited as a member of Al-Anon to come to any Al-Anon or function of Alcoholics Anonymous. I love our fellowships. I love the program. I love what it's done for my life and for my family. You know, I'm very, very grateful. My job, as I understand it, is to share in general a little bit of what I used to be like and what happened and what I'm like now. And, you know, I can remember going to meetings and saying, God, I hope it's not a long drunk-a-log or something like that. But I realized today that the reason they have us share what we used to be like, what happened and what's like today, is if you can't relate to my sickness, you won't need to relate to my recovery. So, that being said, I'm the youngest of 4 children. I'm a change-of-life baby, and I was an Army brat, you know. I loved my daddy like nothing else. I saw tonight when we were having supper a gentleman that was out with his little girl, and they were having a good time together, and I could think, and I wanted to tell that little girl, you know, this is such a precious memory. Hang on to it, because you may not have it for always. My father was retired from the military when I was born, and he was 54. My mother was 41. The closest one to me was my sister. She was 16. Then I had a brother 20, and I had another brother that would have been 25 years older than me, but he had already died. So I was like an only child. And I lived in a world of adults because their friends didn't have little kids. So I learned how to relate to adults. I didn't learn how to relate to children. Had a real difficult time with that as time would go on. My daddy, I just loved my daddy. My daddy was a fun-loving man. He retired and decided he was going to raise bird dogs, and we were going to fish and hunt, and I loved it. Then there was the other person that lived in our house. The warden. She had rules about everything, and her first rule was, you know, you can't have fun. It's not allowed. That's what I used to think. And what it amounted to, my mother was a product of alcoholism. Her father died. He was an under-the-bridge wino. He died in the state hospital with wet brain from alcoholism. Her mother died of cirrhosis of the liver from alcoholism. Her brother was killed when he was shot dead by a man who found him in his bed with his wife, but he was my favorite. She had another brother and 2 sisters, and guess what? They all drank. My mother was the only non-drinking member of her family. I think she needed one. She was the untreated Al-Anon. She was always uptight. She was very anal about everything. She bitched all the time. Wasn't a fun person to be around, so I spent all my time with my daddy. And I would go fishing and hunting with my daddy, and I loved it. And Daddy had all the patience in the world to answer every why question I always had. And then one day, Mama decided to ruin our fishing trip, and she came with us. See, Mama had rules about everything. Mama's rule about fishing was, see, my mother didn't know how to have fun. She made everything a job. And so her deal was she caught the first fish, the biggest fish, and the most fish. Other than that, you can fish. Well, I made a mistake, and I caught the first fish. It was a little bitty fish. Mama took one look at it, ripped it off my hook, and threw it back in. Now I'm 5 years old. She's thrown away my fish. I went into a screaming coma, you know. See, my philosophy of fishing then and now is if it has eyes and a tail, string it. So Daddy told me, he said, honey, come back here to the back end of the boat with me. And as I got close to him, he said, and we'll get her. I didn't know what it meant, but intuitively I knew I was going to like it. And what it meant was every time she'd catch a fish, she'd swing around, he'd take it off her hook, he'd rebait her hook, she'd swing back around, start fishing. He'd give me the fish, and I'd dive it overboard. Every fish the old heifer caught that day, I threw away. Now, Daddy was playing a joke on Mama, but that's not what little 5-year-old MaryPearl got. You see, my whole life has been a series of how I interpret things that's going on around me. You know, it's a disease of perception. And what I perceived was it was okay to get even with anybody. If they hurt you, you do it to them as many times as you can to get back. Now, I don't believe in any way my daddy realized I'm going to teach my child revenge today. But that's what child took. And that's what child took with her and till the days of ALANON and even after. That to me, when it was pointed out to me in an inventory that was a defective character, I thought, no, that's one of my better points. And you see, the thing of it is, when I was doing that four-step inventory, I wrote this down, this incident, as one of my most pleasant childhood memories. Yeah. On November the 30th of 1954, my life changed. I watched my daddy die of a heart attack that night. I was 12 years old. And my world as I knew it ended right there. You see, I had gone with them to church, and I believed that God loved me until that night. And when I saw Daddy die and I was left with her, I knew God didn't love me, because if he had, he would have taken her and left my daddy. And so I turned my back on any kind of spiritual development from the age of 12 on. And these are not things that you do at a conscious level. You know, this is looking at my life from retrospect. And Mama and I sort of declared war on each other. Whoever dies first, the other one wins. It seemed to me Mama went out of her way to make my life miserable, and so I would do everything she told me not to do. I was the total kid you'd want to kill, you know. And so here's my mama. She's an old woman left with a young kid who will not mind. And I can imagine that was very frustrating and scary for her. But you see, I'm not looking at it from Mama's point of view. I'm looking at it from my little self-centered point of view. Now, it seemed to me that I never could do anything to please her. I would try over and over again. You know, you'd like clean your room, and she would come in and in 3 seconds find the one thing you didn't do. And that was the one thing she would pounce on. And so it became apparent to me I couldn't please her. And so if you can't get your attention in a positive manner, you will go to the negative manner if you're like me. And I was the kind that, knowing what the consequences would be, and my mother did not know how to deal with her anger. She only knew how to hit and to hurt. And I would do things that I knew that while she was beating the hell out of me, at least I had her undivided attention. Now that's pretty sick. But that's the way it was at our house. In the late 50s, they put an Air Force base in Arkansas, right there, just right up the road from me. And there was an announcement in the paper, and it said there were 10 men for every woman in the area. And I said, that's it, hot damn, I want my 10. And I want your 10 and your 10. Well, there's never too much of a good thing. If it feels good, do it till you die on the spot. You know? My drug of choice is adrenaline. I love excitement. So if I don't have it, I create it. It's just that simple. So I went trolling. And I found this poor little old Yankee boy. He never knew what hit him. And he told me he would take me away from home. Well, see, that was the main thing. I wanted to be away from home and her more than anything. I was in love with the idea of being in love, and I fell in heat all about the same time, so it worked. He took me further than I asked to go. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. Have you ever noticed when you overshoot the runway, you recognize the end of the runway like this? You never see it coming, but oh, that's what it looks like from back here, you know. So here I am, and he took me to Newfoundland. Anybody here been to Newfoundland? Oh, where? Stephenville? Gander, that's even worse. It was called semi-remote in those days. God forbid you should ever go remote. Our average snowfall was 190 inches a year. And the worst thing about Newfoundland was it was boring. There's not much excitement. I mean, you know, you get over seeing the moose walking around the backyard. You know, the first time it was pretty exciting, but after that, you know, a moose is a moose. And I found excitement in the clubs. This is where, and see, not only that, my mother had said to me, don't ever drink alcohol. We carry the bad seed. Because she's looking back at all of the alcoholics in her family and all the damage that she had suffered as a child from the alcoholism. So you don't drink. So I couldn't wait to get to the clubs. And I associated the sounds of laughter and people having a good time with the sound of ice going in a glass and that liquid going over that ice and making it go as it cracked that ice. Some of y'all relate to this. I can see that. I enjoyed that. And I seemed to have a tremendous capacity for alcohol. Now, my husband played in the band. He was the lead guitar in the band. And so while he would be playing in the band, I'd be trolling the room. I had fun in Newfoundland. I had too much fun. See, that's that overshooting the runway stuff. I had an exciting life. I worked for the Red Cross while I was there. I was assistant field director of Newfoundland and Labrador. You think Newfoundland's bad? Labrador's worse. Just you and the Eskimos up there. Anyway, I had several little ventures there, you know, like I had a black market going on the flight line, stuff like that, just keeping a little excitement going. It came time to come back, and we had extended till they were closing the base, and it was time to come back, and I was checking with a guy in the SAC assignment section about where we were going. Now, I never bothered to ask my husband where it was he wanted to go or whatever. It wasn't really important, you know, because it's all about me, what I want. And so I'm talking to this guy, and he says, well, where do you want to go? And I said, I want to go back to Little Rock Air Force Base because I know it's all going to be different back there now. It's been 5 years. And he said, well, y'all are going to Minot, North Dakota. Minot? I'm not. That's not happening. I said, I'm sick and tired of ice and snow. I'm not going to Minot, North Dakota. And he said, well, I don't know what we can do about this. And I said, well, you know, change it. He said, well, I can't change where you're going. I said, well, then change his career field. And because he said there wasn't an opening in his career field at Little Rock. I said, well, that's simple enough. Change his career field at it. So for a case of Chevys, I sent down on the next plane. We got to go back to Little Rock. Now, my husband was an aircraft mechanic. Overnight, he became the head of a missile inspection team. Ought to make you sleep good tonight. He had never seen a missile. But I got what I wanted. You know, I did that little manipulation thing, and I got what I wanted. And how many times are we going to start it over? You know, it's like playing a game of jacks when I was a kid. You throw a bad hand, you yell overs, and you get to start over. Well, it's like I kept doing that in my life, but somehow kept coming up with the same hand. Isn't that amazing? Because, you see, I didn't know one of the basic rules, and that is wherever you go, there you are. You know, nothing changes till something changes, and I didn't know that. I got back there, and we tried it again, and guess what? One more time, it doesn't work, and that's when I told him, I want to be separated. Now, you may say, well, why didn't you want to be divorced? Well, I wasn't ready to be self-supporting through my own voluntary contributions. I may be sick, but I'm not stupid. And I also played on him. You see, his father and mother were divorced when he was very small. And so he didn't want divorce. That was just not it. He did not want that deal, and I played on that. And so I convinced him with some fast talking for slow thinking that he should go on to his next assignment, and I should stay there. And hippies had happened while I was gone. I'd been out of the country from 60 to 65, and I wanted to experience everything. You know, I'm the kind of person, I want to do everything at least once. And so I told him I needed to find myself. Well, that wasn't necessarily a lie, but I didn't know that because I was lost. And so I decided I wanted to be a hippie, and so he went on, and I stayed there, and I am free. I'm free. I don't have her to tell me what to do. I don't have him to tell me. Not that I ever did what anybody said, but there's something about it. When you're a reactor, you don't know what to do if you're not reacting about something. So I didn't know what to do, and I got a little bored. And so I've always looked out there for fix something that was wrong in here. And I noticed that this guy and his wife across the street from me, he'd go out and get drunk, come home and beat her up, just like my mother's family. One of them. Seen that before. She was a little French-Canadian girl. She didn't speak English very well, and so we became friends, and she came over to the house, and he would go out and beat her up, and she was pregnant. And she came over one night, and he'd come in and beat her up, and she had gone into labor. And she asked me if I would take her to the hospital, and I said, sure. And as I went across the street to help her pack, there he was, passed out on his bed with a smirk on his face. And I looked at him, and I thought, you know, somebody ought to whip your butt. And this is where I had my first spiritual awakening. I am somebody. So I tied him up in a bed sheet, took a slat out of the bed, and I beat the fool out of him. And it just made me feel good all over. Little did I know this was going to be the preview of coming attractions. Did you ever feel like everywhere you go, there they are? There was one that lived on the other side of me over there. You know, it's like being a carrier, you know. And the doctors had told Freeman, they said, Freeman, if you continue to drink, you will die. You are an alcoholic. And so Freeman quit drinking, but he never got any treatment for his alcoholism. He died anyway. But now we know what irritable, restless, and discontent is living next door. Now, I'm the perfect neighbor. I come home at 7 in the morning because I've been out having fun. And he has a garden, and he wants to till it at 8 o'clock in the morning. This does not work. And so I tried to explain to him, and he told me to shut my mouth and get my fat butt back in the house. You see, he didn't know about Mama and the fish. So I got my daddy's frog gig and headlight, and I mowed grass at 11:30 at night. Well, the sheriff came to see me. I'm out there, you know. And so then I found that law enforcement people are very narrow-minded about things like that. So now I go into Plan B. Now, Freeman has beagle dogs. Now, if you've ever had a beagle, you know it's a barking little dog. Well, he had 6, so he had a whole chorus out there in the backyard. So I'd wait till the wee hours of the morning. I'd run off my back porch. I'd take my broom handle, run, and I'd go up and down that dog yard fence, beating on it and get them dogs stirred into complete frenzy. And then I'd run, jump back on my porch and wait. And he'd come out in his underwear, and he'd cuss at them and scream at them and hose them down to shut them up sometimes, and he'd go back in the house. And we'd wait about an hour and do it one more time. The sheriff came to see me. There were several other things, but then I decided that I'd better look elsewhere for entertainment because the sheriff and I were beginning to develop a relationship. And that's when I noticed we have a neighborhood softball team. How did I miss this? I'm an athlete. I loved it in school. So I get me some stretch boots and hot pants, and I joined the team. I have arrived. And it was a mixed team and various ages, and it was our custom after the game to go over to somebody's house and talk about our strategy for our next game, what we could have, should have, whatever, done better. And they were all over at my house this one night, and there was this kid that was at the house. He was 18, which was not legal age to drink, and he got drunk at my house. And I thought, you know, if the sheriff picks him up on the way home, I'm going to have major problems here. So I made him the offer that I would drive him home and have some of them take me back. And we got out there to his pickup, and like I say, he's pretty drunk. And I noticed there's a China tea set sitting on the front seat. I said, what's this? He said, I got it for my mom for Mother's Day. Well, isn't that sweet? But he can't walk hardly, so I know he can't carry that, so I'm going to be ever helpful. Now, here's the picture. It's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm going in a strange house with a drunken 18-year-old kid, and I'm carrying a China tea set. Your everyday situation. And when we got in there, he flipped the light on. In his bedroom, there's a man laying on the bed with nothing but his underwear. And he goes, hot damn, little brother, you brought us a broad home. And I looked at him and I said, I think not tonight, but that's who I'm married to. You know, some people find that interesting. But you know, not too many of y'all found yours in the front row of the choir, I'll bet, either. Well, later on that summer, we met again, and we started dating, and we had such a wonderful time for about 4 years. Now, I recognized early on that he didn't drink right, because it seemed like if he didn't have anything to drink, he was a little too shy. And then after he'd have a couple of drinks, gosh, I liked him. He was a lot of fun, just didn't have him very long because he'd continued to drink. And as he would continue to drink, his personality seemed to change, just like having a harem, all at the same night. And then he would get a mouth on him that I couldn't stand. It was just like an old Chevy trunk lid. You couldn't shut him up, and I'd have to put him out of my misery. Well, after about 4 years of all this wonderful fun, he turns to me and he says, I love you, and I think we ought to get married. Well, there's a time you tell things, and if you go past the right time to tell something, there doesn't seem to be the right time to tell it anymore. And I had neglected to mention something to him. And I said, I can't marry you. And he said, why not? And I said, because I'm already married. He said, you're married? And I said, yes, I forgot. Out of sight, out of mind, And he said, well, my God, he said, I had no idea. And I said, well, how did you think I lived in a nice home and I drove this brand new car and fancy and all like that? I said, how did you think I managed to do that? And I didn't work. He said, I thought you were rich. No. And so what happened was I filed for divorce, and after a period of months and alcoholism moved into my house. I got divorced on Monday, we got married on Friday night, and here came alcoholism. And I didn't see it coming at all. He didn't drink like my mother's family drank. You know how you get the idea of how an alcoholic is in your mind, and if your particular person who's drinking doesn't measure, and you're going to make sure it never measures up to that, And so the disease began. And J.D., it's true, they say it's an allergy, and it's true. He broke out in spots. Memphis, St. Louis, New Orleans. He would drink and then he would disappear. And he might be gone for a week or 2 weeks. Now what happens during that time? I call all the jails, I call all the hospitals, I call all of our friends who are getting fewer. I call all of his family. I would not call my family and let them know anything was wrong. That kind of thing. And so the sneaking and the hiding and all like this. And then he would show up one day and act like he'd been gone 15 minutes. And in an hour's time, I was convinced he had been gone 15 minutes and everything was wonderful and we were back together again. Now, we were going to do that little game, off and on, but the insanity's getting worse. I'm going to work now. I'm working sometimes a lot of overtime because I don't know what I'm going to find when I go home. I don't want to go home anymore. And I keep wondering, what is wrong with me that my husband drinks? And not only that, other women were a problem when he drank. And so, the amazing thing about that is, because of the way I had behaved with my first husband, by being an adulterous wife, when this began to happen to me, I felt like I deserved it. And I accepted unacceptable behavior because of what I had done. And I wouldn't confront the issue, would not confront that issue. And so it gets a little crazy around our house. I begin to blame everything. If you don't have an alcoholic to blame something on, by God, get one. They're the best thing in the world to blame something on, because half the time they can't remember if they did it or not, And there was this one particular day, and I had an old Frigidaire washing machine. Now, I don't know how many of you, most of them here are probably too young, but Frigidaire had a washing machine that the agitator, instead of going back and forth, went up and down, up and down. And one of its trademarks was it ties your clothes in knots. Now, it must have been invented by an alcoholic, that's all I could think. But anyway, I went out there and it had a button on the side of it that said reset, because it knew it was going to go off balance, because when those clothes were tied around those knots, when it would start to spin, it would throw itself out of balance and quit. So I'm out there that day, and I have on this denim sack dress, were popular then, and I had on this denim, and it had this long lapels and long ties, and without realizing it, when I'm rearranging these clothes, my ties got hung in those clothes. Well, I'm here to tell you, wet clothes grab. Because when I pushed that reset button, I went for 16 minutes on drip dry. It jerked my head down on that agitator. I couldn't get away from it, couldn't reach the thing, and I went the whole cycle there. And when that thing let go of me, I didn't have a tooth in my head that didn't hurt. My jaws were black and blue, and it was all his fault. You see, if I hadn't have been preoccupied about where he was at and who he was with and what they were doing, that wouldn't have happened to me. That was all his fault. I blamed everything on him. Then it came to the point where, you throw them out, you take them back. You throw them out, you take them back. And then there comes a point when you just had it. And so I told him, I said, I can't live with you anymore. I can't live like this anymore. And he said, well, I don't mean to do what I do. He said, I just stopped by to have a couple of drinks, and I don't know, something happens to me. I think I'm sick. I said, boy, that is the truth. You are sick, sick, sick. Our ODAT book talks about sarcasm, and it's from the Greek word skarzo. It means to tear flesh. I not only did that, I tore his spirit to ribbons. He always referred to himself as the little dummy because that's what I told him he was. That's a terrible thing to do to another person. But anyway, I took him to the doctor like my little boy. Took him in and I said, here he is. And he told the doctor he thought he had a slight drinking problem. That's like saying the Titanic had a bad day. Slight drink. And the doctor told him, he says, I don't know what to do about alcoholism, but there's a group of people that seem to know, and that's Alcoholics Anonymous. And JD said, I'm not an alcoholic. And I said, that's right, he's not. And so the doctor said, well, I don't know what to tell you. And JD says, well, I got some friends that are fighting this alcohol deal. And he says, they're taking a drug called Antabuse. If I could get a prescription for Antabuse. Now, what I heard the doctor say was, if you give him one of these pills every day, he can't drink. That is not what the doctor said. But you see, I have so long been in this world where I hear what I want to hear and I see what I want to see. I don't see what I don't want to see. That fantasy world that I was living in is called denial. Denial does have a place. Denial, I think, sometimes is what we use to save our minds until we can find a solution to the problem. Because if I have a problem that is there and that problem is there and I can't find a solution to it, then I don't have that problem. I can't live with having that problem unsolved. And so I would go into denial. Anyway, I go home now and I am the keeper of the pills. I've been diagnosed years before for high blood pressure because of stress. Wonder why, And then I have this dog that's epileptic, and JD's on the pill. So every morning in a hurry going to work, I can't guarantee who got what, but everybody got a pill. Now, I have sang this song all these years, if you'll quit drinking, I'll be okay. Now, that makes as much sense as to say, I've got a headache, you take my aspirin, I'll feel better. That's the same thing, but I didn't know that. And so all of a sudden now he's not drinking. And see, I knew this was the solution. He's not drinking. Guess what? I'm not okay. I am not okay. He's got no treatment for his alcoholism, irritable, restless, discontent. What is the nature of an untreated ALANON? Irritable, restless, uncontent, and crazy. And so here we were. We were both really, really sick. We could not agree on the smallest of items. It was a major deal just to say, what do you want for supper? He'd say anything. I'd say, you want fried chicken? No, I don't want fried chicken. What do you want? Anything. Do you want spaghetti? No, you make the world's worst spaghetti. Thank you. And so finally I would decide on something and I would fix it and I'd put it on the table and he'd look at it and he'd say, do you expect me to eat that? And I said, well, you have a choice. You can eat it or you can wear it. Sometimes he ate it, sometimes he wore it. It wasn't happy at our house. We fought over any and everything. And so finally, that was the summer that the committee moved in. It was a day like any other day. I was sitting there thinking, that's one of the things when people I sponsor say, I've been thinking, I get cold chills. But I got to thinking, I'm so miserable. God, isn't that the truth? Well, what do you want to do? I don't know, but I just can't stand this any longer. Well, let's get a divorce. We can't get a divorce. Why can't we get a divorce? Well, you've already had to divorce one other. What seems to be the common denominator? We're not going there. Well, he could do something like die. What was that? Well, if he were to die, you could be a widow. That's better than being a divorcee. Oh, I like this. But he doesn't seem to be dying. We can take care of that. Well, Well, what do you want to do? Well, let's see. I want to take an ice pick, stab him in the neck, and watch him drip. Oh, that feels so good. Or we could back over him with the car, squish him up in the tread, make a note, buy new tires. I began to feel better. There was light at the end of the tunnel. Now, we both know, or we all should know, that there's some insanity here. Now, we talked about sponsors today. Do you realize the need of a sponsor? If I'd have had somebody that I could have run that past, she wouldn't have said, go for it. But when I'm sponsoring me, I said, go for it. And then I read in the paper where a lady had killed her husband, said he was an alcoholic, and they put her in prison. And I thought, tacky, tacky, tacky. That wouldn't have happened if I'd have been on that jury. I can guarantee you that. And so now I've got to regroup. So we have to have another meeting. And so that fall, we're having another one of these think sessions. And then it came to us, if an alcoholic were to pass out in the bathtub and drown, who would know? We all liked it. It was a group conscience. So now we have a solution. We just have to wait, And sure enough, a year to the week, he went on Anabuse. Guess who got drunk? I came home that day. We had ice and snow, and everything was shutting down early. We can get a forecast of snow in Arkansas, and they close the schools. And that's the truth. And so anyway, I heard our truck coming in, and it sounded like he was doing about 60 in second gear, one of those sounds, And when he came in, then we have a hitch and post horse at the end of the drive, and he clipped it off. And then he went flying sideways across the yard, and he hit the tree. And then he bounced into the side of our brick house. And I thought, man, he cannot drive on ice and snow. But then he opened that truck door, and he poured out. I'd seen that too many times. And I'm looking out that window, and I said, I'll kill that SOB if it's the last thing I ever do. So when he came to the door and opened the door, usually my mouth was attached to that doorknob, but it wasn't this day. When he opened that door, I jerked that doorknob back. He came in, and I hauled off and hit him as hard as I could. And when he fell, he hit the coffee table, and it knocked him out. And I dragged him across the living room, and I dragged him down the hall into the bathroom, and I ran the water in the bathtub, and I filled that puppy up. And then I took his clothes off of him and put him in that bathtub, and I held him under. I held him until the bubbles quit coming. And there was a voice that said, you can't do this. Look what you're doing. And I picked him up by the hair of the head, and I said, the hell I can't. And I put him back down again. And I'm looking at him, and the voice comes back, and it's not one of the committee members. And the voice says, do you not realize you're committing murder? You're taking the life of someone you once loved. It's a moment of clarity in which you see the reality of what you become. I had become an animal to fight an illness, and it liked to have scared me to death. And I snatched him out of that bathtub, and thank God I had worked for the Red Cross, and I was able to resuscitate him. And I took him into our bedroom, and I dried him off, and I lugged him and pushed him and got him up in the bed, and I got the hair dryer down and dried his hair because I didn't want him to catch cold. Now, only an Al-Anon would understand that. Women, anytime a guy has a cold, they're the hardest thing to deal with. So, dead is one thing, a cold's another, But I left that, I shut the door on that bedroom, and I went in my living room, and I sat there, and I rocked and rocked for 8-10 hours. And it's like, it was desperation like I had never known, because I didn't know how to live like that any longer. And I didn't know how not to live like that any longer. I had done, and my very best had brought me to here. I didn't go back in that room for 3 days. I heard him scream for help. I heard a lot of things, but I was afraid of what I would do if I went in there. And you see, I didn't know anything about alcoholism. J.D. had gone into alcohol poisoning. He nearly hemorrhaged to death in that room. I wouldn't go in that room. I came home from work one day, and you say, how do you live with yourself after what you've done? Well, it's real simple. My two best friends. Justification and rationalization. If he hadn't got drunk, I wouldn't have had to do that. You see, I give myself a good reason for bad behavior. I excuse away. I don't take responsibility for my actions. That's what that's all about. And so I came home, and he was sitting at our bar, and he looked really, really bad. He had lost down to, he weighed like 120 pounds. And he was shaking, he was just vibrating. And he said, would you call that Alcoholics Anonymous number for me? He said, I've been trying all day and I keep getting the wrong number. We had push-button phone, and every time he'd try, he's shaking so hard he'd get a wrong number. So I told him, okay. But first I looked at him and I said, what can a group of drunks do for you that I haven't done? You know? And he said, I don't know, but I'm going to die if I don't get some help. So I called, and they told me there was a meeting 6 blocks away from our home in a community building that had been built by my grandfather, who died of alcoholism. And that's where I went to Girl Scouts when I was a kid in that building. And that's where AA were having their meetings. And they were having one in 1 hour's time. And so I took J.D. to his first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we were in such great shape when we got there that they rushed me into AA and him into Al-Anon. They thought it was me because I was wearing my leopard skin coat. I had black and white racing checkerboard sunglasses and a red hat. And they thought I was hiding my eyes and everything under all this costume. And no, I just didn't want to be there with a bunch of drunks was what the matter was, you know. But anyway, they got it straightened around, and thank God for old-fashioned AA, because there was a man there that looked worse than Grandpa did when we buried him. And he looked at J.D. and he said, boy, I'm going to be your sponsor. You know, he wasn't waiting around to see if J.D. could relate. They could see that J.D. was near dead. And so they immediately, and I love that. In my home group in Al-Anon, if you're there and you don't have a sponsor, we can get you one before the night is over. We get you a temporary sponsor because we know that recovery starts when you make a commitment to your recovery by getting a sponsor. But anyway, like I said, there were only 2 women in that Al-Anon group there that night, and they said, we have Al-Anon, it's for you. And I said, excuse me? I said, there's nothing wrong with me. So I went on my merry way, and every time J.D.'d go to a meeting, they'd send literature back by way of him, and I'd throw that trash over there in the desk. I don't know why I didn't throw it away. But then there was that night that J.D. and his sponsor didn't come back after the meeting, and I knew they was both out drunk. And I began to look through that desk, and I came across that material, and as I read it, it was like somebody had been looking inside of my walls of our home. Real scary. And there was a card there that said, my name's Earlene, if you ever want to talk. It's 11:30 at night. Earlene, I want to talk. She never said a word about the time. She was asleep. She talked with me and told me about Al-Anon. I said, well, if it ever gets that bad for me, I'll come. Thank you. Yeah. And then J.D., who worked maybe once or twice a week for 10 years, once he got sober, he got fired. Is that ironic? But you see, J.D. had prayed and asked God to help him stay sober, and he could drink on the job. And so God removed him from his playground and his playmates. But that's what brought me to my knees, because all of a sudden the entire responsibility of everything fell on me. That was when I said to him, you know, I don't know, there's nothing left to manage. How do you keep an alcoholic sober? And they told me they didn't know. But they did the things that we do best, and that is they told me they understood, and they began to share their stories with me. And you know, for a long time I wondered why I kept going back to Al-Anon, because I wasn't doing anything any different. And it was the unconditional love that I got there. There's something about unconditional love that'll keep calling you back. And I knew when I got off work and I could drive my car over there and just park in front of the building, it was like safe. I've made it. It may be 3 hours before the meal, and I can read I can read. I bought every book Al-Anon had at that time. We had a total of 5 books and a dozen pamphlets or something. And I got them, and I got in there, and I read, and I read them, and I read them, and I read them. That was one of my first jobs in service in my home group was a literature person. I loved it. Anyway, moving right along, I got active with my sponsor, and I got to work in the steps. And let me tell you, when you begin to work the steps in your life, hang on. Your life is going to change. There's going to be a difference made. And it's going to be unsettling to a lot of people because you're going to be doing things differently. And usually I tell somebody when I'm sponsoring them, and they say, well, my husband is not real thrilled with Al-Anon. I said, it's working. It's working. We're not playing the game anymore. It's working. Keep on keeping on. You know, I love it. That's another thing we do. We say, it works, it works, it works. I think I'll quit. You know, and then you wonder, you know, it's always amazing to me when people say, well, you know, I'm getting a little complacent. Well, I'll say, well, what have you quit doing that you were doing that you felt good? Go back and see what it is you've quit doing. It's always something that was working for you that you just quit doing. Shorten yourself on your meditation or your prayer or something. There's something you're not doing, and that's what it amounts to. Anyway, I went on, and like I say, JD, I focused on me, and after about a year, I looked at him and I thought, you know, he's a pretty nice old guy. I had gained some respect for him. And I told my sponsor, I said, when is he going to make amends to me? She said, every day he's not drinking, except that is part of an amends. Because she says, without his sobriety, you don't have a chance. She said, alcohol will be his mistress. You will not have a chance. And so I began to accept him, and I began to see all of the things that other people could see in him, you know. It's much easier. I see a lot of people come in the program and they get rid of their partners. It's easier to start a new one that's not damaged, isn't it? But if you don't change, you'll damage the next one just exactly like you damaged the first one, you know. But it's much more rewarding when you can take one that's damaged and watch God do the healing process on that and then bring you back, and you'll be closer than you've ever been before. That's been my experience. The worst relationship was with Mama, of course. Didn't like Mama. You know, the main thing I wanted from Mama was just for her to love me. And for whatever reason, I never felt my mother loved me. I couldn't feel that love from Mama. And Mama would do some things sometimes, but she was always very judgmental, critical. She never gave me any praise for doing good. I was a class valedictorian. She never bothered to come to graduation. Those kind of things were very, very painful. And when I see people today making all of those soccer games and all of those things, I'm going, my God, Mom never went to anything, you know. What I would have given to see just one time somebody out there, you know. But anyway, I told him, I said, you know, my mama's getting old, and I don't want to die and then have to do a graveside amends with her. I just really don't. I had done one with my brother-in-law, and I said, I think they're much more rewarding when you do them, like it says, made direct amends. Now, the very first time I decided to make an amends with Mama, I had been in the program about 3 weeks. Now, I would suggest that you work the step your own instead of jumping ahead. You know, I went to a meeting on amends, and I thought, yeah, this is a good thing. So I went in at my mama's, and I said, you know, Mama, you always said you thought I hated you. Well, you were right. This doesn't lay the groundwork for a good amends, let me tell you. And so my sponsor's going, oh, my God, you didn't. I said, I did. She said, well, you can make an amends for an amends. It'll have to happen. So here we are years later, and I'm ready to try to work on this relationship, but I don't know where to begin. But I'll tell you, when the student is ready, God puts the teachers in your path. And there was a girl who came to our group. She'd from another state, and she had worked on a lot of mother stuff. And so she said, you're going to have to accept that your mother is the way she is and quit asking her to be the kind of mother you always wanted her to be. She can't be that person. That's your fantasy of how you want your mama to be. You're going to have to give up your dream and accept what you got. Now, that's a better pill. I mean, that is hard to take. I cried all the way from the meeting that night, all the way home, and as I crossed the bridge from Little Rock into North Little Rock, I said, God, I'm going to ask you to be my mama. I can't do this deal anymore. And I've got to accept Mama like she is, so I'm going to ask you. And I realized, my sponsor had been more of the kind of mother that I'd always wanted than my mother had been capable of having. Of course, I hadn't done all the things to my sponsor I did to my mother either. You got to look at reality there, And that was the first part of that. And then I began to quit arguing with Mama. I was told, why don't you treat your mother like a loving daughter instead of like a little ornery that you are? And I don't know how to treat Mother like a loving daughter. I've never been a loving daughter. How do you do that? Ask people who have a good relationship. Oh, God. Now, that's hard to find, too, But I would ask, and they would tell me things. And here it would be coming up Mother's Day, and that was always the dilemma. You got to get the card and the gift, and the cards, oh my God, they say such syrupy, sweet crap. I wanted one that said, Happy Mother's Day, bitch. Well, I have a computer. I could do that today. But instead, I got her one time with these Maxine shoebox cards. It says, the longer you bitch, the longer God lets you live. Mama's 80. She's not real appreciative of that. And so anyway, I went on and I bought that sweet card, and it was hard. My sponsor had to mail the first one for me. I couldn't bring myself to mail it. I did sign it, but I couldn't mail it. But then the next one, it gets easier. You do it, you take the right action, and the feelings will follow. And I kept saying, my feelings are way behind these actions here. They're not just running right over them, I'm telling you. And I'd go over, try to talk. My mother and I could not be in the same room together 5 minutes. We were not in an argument. If I said it was black, she said it was white. If I said it was up, she said it was down, and we were off and running. And I was told, when you feel like you've got to tell her, leave. Oh, I can do that? Yes. It's easier than to stand there and keep going through the argument, and then I would go home hating myself and feeling a failure one more time. And so I got to where I could do that. And then when my mother would call, I would pick up the phone and I'd say, hello, and she'd say, MaryPearl, and I'd go, oh, God, it's her. And used to, I would just put the phone down, and every once in a while go, yeah, But I was told that a loving daughter would listen. And I said, but you don't understand. My mother's conversation is so boring. She's going to tell me what she had for breakfast. She's going to tell me how many times she went to the bathroom. She's going to do this. She said, she's sharing with you her life. That is her life. Oh. It's not exciting. It was just an everyday, ordinary life, but she was sharing the events of what is going on, and do her the honor of listening, and not having to be a smartass about it. And so when I began to do that, I'd go in the bathroom, get on my knees. When I'd hear her voice, I'd say, Mama, hang on a minute. I'd run to the bathroom, go over there, say, God, it's her. Help me. Help me be the kind of daughter I'm supposed to be. Go back to the phone. Yes, Mama. She said, what's the matter with you? Every time I call, have you got a bladder infection or something? And then I was given the best tool. And this is, ask God to show your mother like He sees her. Look at your mama through God's eyes. You see, God is love, and so God is always going to look through eyes of love. He's not going to be judging her. He's not going to be criticizing her. He's not going to be trying to determine if it's right or wrong. He's just going to love her. Ask God to help you to do that. And so I prayed that prayer for 5 years. Our relationship was getting better, but I was not near where I wanted to go. And then one day in the fall, I went over to my mother's, and we had 10 acres, and I could see she was out in the back. She was raking leaves. But something amazing happened that day. I realized my mother was short. Now you say, you don't know how tall your mother is? Evidently not. My mother came up to here on me. But when I was around my mother, she was this tall. Now, why was that? Because you always come as a child. You never come as one adult to another adult. You come as a child saying, give me, give me, give me. You see, I wanted my mother's approval. She never gave it to me. And I'm grateful today because I would have thought that was love. There's a world of difference between love and approval. And so here we were. And as I walked back to see her, it's like God let me see inside her heart, and it had all these scars and stuff over it. And you see, I always felt my mother withheld love to punish me. But you can't give what you don't have. And my mother didn't know how to love. But I had been taught how to love in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon. And I knew if I was going to bring love and have love in this relationship, I was going to be the one to have to bring it. And so I put my arms around my mother and I gave her the very first hug. Because you know it says treat people like you would a newcomer. And so I gave her that hug. And she is stiff as a poker. She was very uncomfortable, but I was consistent when I would go to see her, and I would pat her, and I would hug her, and I would touch her. There is great power in the human touch. And I would do those things consistently. And then one day I went by my mom's, and she said, MaryPearl, I want to know why you were always such an ornery kid after your daddy died. And I said, I was getting even with you for not loving me. And she said, what do you mean I didn't love you? I gave you a roof over your head, clothes to wear, food to eat. It was more than I ever had. You see, my mother had come from that alcoholic home where her father was a vicious, mean drunk. And she had scars all over her body where he had cut her with knives and stuff when he'd be drunk. And he came in one night and he tried to rape her. She was between 12 and 13 years of age. And she picked up a stick of stove wood, hit him in the head, and knocked him out, and ran away from home. And she walked hundreds of miles and slept in culverts and stole food out of gardens till she got to Memphis, Tennessee. Because she knew that Grandpa'd kill her if he ever got near her again. And she was living in this alleyway next to a boarding house. And the lady who owned the boarding house was pregnant. And she told my mama if she'd come in and work in the boarding house, she'd give her room and board. My daddy was the head of the recruiting office for the Army in Tennessee. And he took his meals at that boarding house. And that's where they met. And when she turned 16, they got married. Now, if you'd had to live like that, what's the greatest gift you could ever give a child? Never to worry about a roof over your head, never to worry about clothes to wear, never to worry about food to eat. You see, she gave more than she ever had. And you know something? It became enough. And I looked at my mom and I said, you know, Mom, I've been a rotten kid a lot of the times, and I have done many things over the years that have hurt you. What can I do today to make that up to you? What can I do? And my mama looked at me and she said, forgive me for not being the kind of mama you needed. And I said, Mama, I forgive you. And my mother got up and she walked across the room and she put her arms around me and gave me the first hug. And she said, baby, I love you. I've always loved you. And that hole inside of me went away. It was a long process. But you see, all that hurt had come over a long period of time. It doesn't just instantly get back. But it's a process. Healing is a process. And my mother and I had 3 or 4 years of being able to really enjoy each other. And then my mother got a mental illness. And part of it is they turn on the ones they love. And so my mother was determined, and she was convinced that I was trying to steal from her and kill her. And I thought, Mama, when this was true, you never ever had it. And I tried to joke it away. And then one day I went over to see her. My mother chased me around the house and down the drive with a pair of scissors trying to stab me. And I knew I couldn't be around her anymore. And so I went to my sister and I said, Dorothy, she had mother's power of attorney. I said, Mama needs to be put away. She's dangerous. And she says, I can't because I promised her I wouldn't. And I said, well, you know, Dorothy, you should never promise anybody something like that. You know. But I said, I can't be around her. And 2 weeks later, Mama had the beginning of a series of strokes. And over the next 5 years, my mother had strokes until she finally passed away. But she knew Dorothy had put her in the nursing home after that first stroke. It shut down her communication, and she couldn't talk and read and write and what have you. But she knew Dorothy had done that, so when we went to the nursing home to visit her that first time, she motioned for us to come in her room, and she shut the door, and I thought, not a good sign. And she turned around and she slapped Dorothy across the room. And Dorothy just went down. And Mama looked over at me, and I thought, am I next? And no, Mama came over and gave me a hug. Because, you see, she was mad at Dorothy, and I became the good kid again. And Dorothy had never suffered any physical abuse from Mother, where I had on a daily basis for years. And I told her, I said, one little slap and it got you. You're such a weenie, my God, you know. You know, I look back over my life during all those years when I'm looking at Mama and I'm wanting her to be the kind of Mama I wanted. And I'm going, God, where was the Mama I needed during that period of time? It was very apparent to me. My sister Dorothy had been my Mama all those years. My sister had no children. And she had been the kind of Mama I always wanted, and I took it for granted because I was looking for it from over here. I missed the whole thing. I'd been getting it, and I missed it. And so I was able to honor my sister and to tell her that she had always been a Mama, and she said, you were always like a kid to me. And so Dorothy and I had always had a good relationship. Well, on November the 30th of 1999, 45 years to the day I watched Daddy die, Dorothy died in the front seat of my car with me. And we were 6 blocks away from the hospital, and I began to pray, and I mean bumper-to-bumper traffic, and I said, God, do I drive? Do I do CPR? What do I do? And all of a sudden, here came a motorcycle cop, which we very rarely see anymore, and he made the traffic part, and we zipped her over there. She was blue by the time I got her there, and they told me there was very little hope. Dorothy's kidneys had failed, and it threw her heart in a bad rhythm, and it stopped. So it was not a heart attack. So they were able to jump-start her and get her going and give her an emergency dialysis. But Dorothy was in a coma for almost 30 days. And I didn't get Dorothy back. We have her body, but Dorothy's memory is gone. She lost about 25 years right off the top, and her short-term memory lasts 10 or 15 minutes now. I was able to keep her in her own home for 5 years, and then the cost of that became absolutely impossible. And so this past December the 27th, I had to put my sister in a nursing home for the rest of her life, sell her home and her possessions. That's probably one of the most painful things I have ever had to do. On the 1st of this past December, we were at home, and J.D. was in bed asleep. I was talking to a girl I sponsor, and his physician called us at home, told me to get him immediately to his office. We were probably going to put him in the hospital that night. And I said, what is the matter? Because he had been there 2 days earlier for his annual physical. He said, J.D.'s blood sugar is 600. He said, your husband is major diabetic. Now, he's been getting regular physicals for years. Nothing has ever shown up. J.D. was always one of these. He could eat anything he wanted, as much as he wanted, never gained weight. I hated him. And so we're tearing over there. And anyway, so now J.D. is a diabetic. We get that news. And then, then I have to go through. J.D., I went to his doctor the other day, and with oral medication, J.D.'s blood sugar is running between 90 and 110 because he's doing what the doctor told him to do. That's the thing, the discipline of this program. You don't have to want to do it. You don't have to like doing it. You just, by God, do it. And he's telling me, you mean I can't have a quart of ice cream before I go to bed every night? I said, not unless you want to close your eyes forever. You got a choice, But it's been quite an adjustment for him. And these, going through periods of change is very stressful. Very stressful. But my sister, Dorothy, I had her with me Thursday. I go down to the nursing home twice a week, and I get her and bring her home. And I try to have as normal a life with her as possible. And, she can't remember that she's been to my house 15 minutes after she's gotten back there. But I remember, She said to me one time, she says, I'd hoped that we could go to Hawaii before I died. I said, Dorothy, we've been to Hawaii 8 times for a month each time. Really? I said, you want I should hula here for you? You have to develop a sense of humor. You really do. Dorothy says, you got to promise me now if I die in the car with you again that you will not take me and have me revived. I said, don't worry. If you die in the car with me, I'll drive you around 6 or 8 hours till you're stiff as a damn poker. You know, she kept wondering why Mama didn't come and visit her because, see, she doesn't remember Mama having a stroke, being in a nursing home. All those years, it's all gone. So I took her out to the cemetery, and she looks at that stone, and she sits there, and she says, "It's so confusing. Where was I when this happened?" I said, "Honey, you were here. You were in charge." And she says, "It's just so confusing." I said, "Dorothy, I cannot imagine. I can't imagine what it would be." She says, "You know, it's like waking up on a foreign planet." She says, "I'm just so lost all the time." And this was a brilliant businesswoman who was with Procter & Gamble 48 years, an executive. She can't read a book because she can't remember what's on this page by the time she gets to that page. It's so sad. I don't know what the deal is there. It's like I tell God all the time. I said, you know, I guess Dorothy's teaching me truly living in the now, because that's where she is. She won't be here 15 minutes from now. She'll be in the new now. Her favorite program is CNN News. You see, it's the same thing every 30 minutes, but it's new to her every time. You know? You don't know. But like I say, just because you're in the program doesn't make you bulletproof. Life is going to continue to happen. So, you know, it says in the book, more shall be revealed. So there we are. I had to go back to work in the year 2000, and I worked for an adoption attorney. And for a woman who never had any children of her own, I get to see lots of little babies now. You know, so it's a very rewarding thing to be able to provide a service. And see, that's what the program has taught me. Well, you ever wonder what your purpose on life is? To be of service to God and your fellow man. So I'm creating a service. I'm doing a service. And guess what? I get paid for it. It feels good. What more could you ask for? God has been very good. I worked with a fellow ALANON, a girl I used to sponsor and then fired her because she wouldn't do the deal. I told her, I said, you know, if this doesn't work for me or if it doesn't work for you, let's just tell each other. And it was real funny because her girl that in her one girl office had to have surgery and was out, and so I worked there for 6 weeks while that girl was on surgery for fun, just to help her out with her office stuff. And then 5 years later, when the girl decided to move away, and I knew I was going to have to go to work, I prayed the prayer one night, and I said, God, you know, I'm going to have to go to work, and I don't know, you know, I'm not a young woman anymore. I don't know what this is all about, but I'm going to have to go to work, because you see, that same year all this stuff happened with Dorothy. I found out I had a heart condition. JD's company was sold. They did away with our pension. JD like 6 months to retire, and they did away with our pension. So I had to go back to work. And you know, no, sometimes life isn't fair, you know, but be grateful, because if life were fair, my life wouldn't be near as good as it is. You know, ask for mercy, never fairness. Mercy. And then I got a call from her the very next morning after I had prayed that prayer, and she said, my girl's leaving, would you come to work for me? And I said, well, I don't know that if I can work for her. She said, I will take whatever days and hours that you want to work. You can set your own schedule. Now, where do you get a job like that? You know, so I was able to fulfill my commitments to my program, and I was able to go to work and to have a living, and, you know, and such a rewarding thing. I know that God goes ahead and he plans in love. So whatever I have to do when I get there, God's going to have everything in place, because God loves me, just like he loves you. My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I do not choose the colors, but he worketh steadily. Oft times in sorrow, sometimes foolish pride, I forget the top while he the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttle cease to fly will God unroll a canvas and explain the reasons why. But the dark threads are as needful in a skillful weaver's hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern God has planned. Thank you so much.